sprechen ist heute hier. Special Guest from Portland ist Stephen John.
Thank you very much. Is this guy on? Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah, so this will actually be more of a show and tell than a lecture. Ooh, hold on one second. Looks like I have it set to auto advance, which is what we do at our conferences. We have auto advancing slides, and you turn it off. Okay, cool. Start over. Oh. All right. Well, that is the preview of the talk. I hope that made a lot of sense. One more time. Okay, good. So this will be more of the show and tell than a lecture. What I'm going to talk about tonight is how simply measuring and monitoring my stress taught me a lot about myself that I didn't know before. So first, oh my gosh, really? Okay. At the conferences, there's always one talk that has some sort of technical issue, and apparently it's mine tonight. Okay, third time is a charm. Okay. But yeah, so first, who am I? Why am I here? Andreas pretty much went over that. I am from Portland. I work for Quantified Self Labs, and we do put on conferences. We put on the conference in San Francisco. Andreas was there. Over 600 people attended. My role there is as a speaker coordinator, and what that means is I help other people tell their quantified self stories. It can often be hard to tell your own story, so I try to help them with that process because I feel like sharing experiences is actually very important, and a lot of learning can come from that. And we just had the Quantified Self Europe Conference in Amsterdam, which I talked about before. But tonight, my story starts with an EEG-based evaluation in 2012. This is for some neurofeedback therapy. And so they measure your brain waves, and then they tell you all these things about yourself that you didn't know before. And during that session, during that evaluation, I learned something about the nature of stress. And most people know that when you talk about stress, they often use the phrase in English, fight or flight, to have a fight or flight response. And what this person told me is that there's actually a third thing, a third reaction, a third response to stress, which is freeze. And she said, looking at your brainwave measurements, you seem to have a freeze response to stress. And reflecting on it, I thought, you know what, that actually resonates with me, that makes sense, because I have this terrible habit of staying late at work, because I'm like, I have to get this done, I'm going to stay here for however long it takes to get this done, but then I stay for a really long time until it's really late, and I didn't actually do that much work. And so it's just like, I feel stressed, and I'll stay in that same state, but I don't actually get anything done. And I have an interest in memory, improving memory retention. Advocate talks about this. But yeah, through that I learned like stress has a negative physiological impact. You know, it can shrink your hippocampus, which is necessary to help you form new memories. It affects your ability to learn. So it's something that I was like, okay, well, it's important for me to understand this and ensure that I'm not the victim of chronic stress. And so I needed to measure stress somehow. I didn't do the neurofeedback therapy where I got that EEG evaluation because it cost about $3,500. But instead I used this tool. It's called the M-Wave 2. This is around 2012, so there's now newer versions of this that are basically on your phone. But this is a standalone device that at the time I think cost around $200. I think it's cheaper now. But the way it works is, actually I have it right here, and you have a sensor that you clip into it, or you connect to it. And it clips to your ear, and it can actually measure your blood flow, your heartbeats, through the blood that courses, that goes through your ear. And what it does with that information is your heartbeat changes according to your stress state. So if you're in a stress state, the heart will beat differently. And I won't get into the science of it, but it has to do with the amount of time in between beats. The pattern is different. And so what this device does is it takes that information and it just has a single output, which is this little area right here. It's a light. And if it detects that you're in a stress state, the light will show red. If you are in a relaxed, or what the manufacturer calls a coherent state, it will be green, and blue is in between. And then this is a sort of like breath meter that you like follow along. So like as it goes up, you like take in a breath. And as it goes down, you breathe out. So that's what the tool is that I used. And the term for this type of measurement is heart rate variability. And that refers to the amount of time in between beats. And so the way that you're supposed to use it is kind of like meditation, where like meditation, you like, set aside 10 minutes in the morning and you try to meditate, and hopefully it keeps you calm and collected throughout the rest of the day. They suggest something like that with this device, where in the morning you sit there and you do it for 10 minutes and you try to make sure the light is green for as long as possible. I found that like I just didn't have time in the morning to do that. Like, I felt like what I really need is a stress alert system. I need something to tell me when I'm feeling stressed, and then I'll stop and I'll try to calm myself down. And so I'll show you how I did that. The device actually connects, you can use it by itself, or you can connect it to a computer. And if you connect it to a computer, this is the program that you see, this is the interface. And so what this shows you is your heart rate in real time. And so you'll see that it'll go a little slower, go a little faster. And this is actually not a very good heartbeat to have. The pattern here is sort of like jagged, and that's not very good. But yeah, so that shows it over time, and then this will show you where you are currently. So this is basically saying that I'm currently in a stress state, and I've been so 49% of time during the session. And then this is some sort of like scoring thing that I usually don't really look at. And you can set it up so they'll play sounds. And so when you're in like a coherent high state, it'll play this little sound that's like a ding, ding, ding. It's high pitched. And if you are in the stress state, it'll play a lower sound, like a dong, dong, dong. And so since I want to be an alert system, I just turned off the sound for these two levels and just left on the sound for the lowest level. So while I was working, if I was starting to get stressed, I would hear the sound play, dong, dong, dong. And so I did that for a few months. And I found out some things about myself from that. First thing I found out is I'm stressed all the time. The alert would go off many, many times during an hour. So according to this tool, I am filled with stress. And the sad thing is actually I believe it. And I'll show why. This is, like I kind of showed this before, this is what like it typically looks like while I'm working. You see the heart going up and down all over the place. Small jagged spikes, not good. And to show you how it could look different, this is my heart rate during meditation. And you'll just notice that like there's a very big difference. You see these really nice, smooth, almost like sine wave sort of curves. And so that was like my first indication. It's like, oh wow, like if you are doing meditation with really long breaths, you are physiologically responding so much differently. Your body is acting so much differently. Another thing I learned is that, so the way it worked, so I said that it was an alert system, so it would tell me, okay, you're feeling stressed. Then I would stop, and I would do deep breaths until I got from red back to green. And I found if I did that throughout the day, it was kind of annoying because you're trying to work, and then something tells you to stop and do a breathing exercise. I found that if I did that throughout the day, I would have more energy. So when 1700 would roll along, I would actually have a lot more energy when I went home, and I could work on other things. A typical day, I would feel exhausted at the end of the workday, and all I wanted to do was just go home and watch TV or whatever. Another thing I learned from doing this is that if I had a stressful event in the morning, I never really fully recovered. No matter what I did, I can never fully come back. And so I would try meditating, I would try doing the heart rate variability training, I would try taking a nap, and I never really felt normal. And that the only thing that allowed me to sort of have a reset was to just go to sleep that night. And so that just taught me that it's very good not to have very stressful events early in the morning, because it can have a big impact on the rest of your day. But then I discovered some really, really interesting stuff. I noticed that there were things that I did during the day that were closely tied to stress. So here's an example. I noticed this pattern that would happen, which is, well, here's what happened. I would be working, I'd be like, oh, let's look at Reddit. So I'd look at Reddit, and then our Google News, some news site, and then the alert would go off. Dong, dong, dong. My first thought was, why is the news stressing me out? But later, I realized what was happening was I was feeling stressed, and then I would open up Reddit to help me get away from the stress. There was just a little bit of a delay with the tool. And so I noticed a cycle that, okay, I would feel stress as a trigger, I would read Reddit, and the reason why I would read something like Reddit is that there's a sort of dopamine hit whenever you see interesting articles, funny pictures or whatever. I wasn't reading the difficult articles, I was reading the very easy articles. And I just basically did that until the stress would die down, and then go back to work, and probably shortly after, the stress would trigger again. Because this action, this behavior is sort of tied to dopamine, where I would get a little bit of a dopamine hit. I was probably going to Reddit because I was sort of low on dopamine. It's sort of, one thing about dopamine releases is it reinforces things. So if you do something, there's a dopamine release, it reinforces it so that you're much more likely to do that behavior in the future. And so, I've been looking at articles for at work for the past couple of years. I never realized that it was due to stress. And it made me think about, okay, in what other ways was my life being dictated by the stress response? Another thing that I noticed is I stress eat. So if I feel stressed, I'll go out and get some snack that's not good for me, and I'm not hungry. That was just me needing to feel good or whatever, because I was feeling stressed out. And there's something else that was a little disturbing. This is a term that most people know called learned helplessness. But it's not something that people think about themselves that often. And so just to illustrate what learned helplessness is, there was an experiment done that's really horrifying to read, but they had a dog, and the dog was in a cage, and they would shock the dog. And it was in a cage, it couldn't do anything. And so it would yelp, it would howl, but it couldn't do anything. It would get shocked again, and it would get shocked again. And eventually the dog would just lie down as it got shocked over and over. It knew it couldn't do anything, so it didn't respond. What was interesting, though, is they opened the door to the cage. And the dog kept getting shocked, and it didn't notice that the door was open. It didn't leave the cage. It stayed there while it was getting shocked over and over. And that's really, it's a really sad story. It's not a story. You know, it was a sad experiment. And I tried to think about, is that something that actually happens to me? And I thought of a good example of that, which is when I first started working, before Quantified Self Labs, I worked as a data analyst for an energy efficiency organization. And there were a few examples where I felt very overwhelmed with work. I had too much work. And I went to my manager and I said, I need some help, I have too much work. And a couple times the manager did not help at all. He's like, okay, I'm going to fix this. I'm like, all right, cool, I'm not going to worry about this work while you fix it. And he would come back, he's like, I couldn't fix it. You have to do that work. It's like, great, well, I wish I would have had this last week to do this work. And so what happened was that I just learned that I can't go to my manager for help. And so I just stopped doing it. Even after I got a new manager, I wouldn't ask for help when I felt overwhelmed. I would just say, okay, I'm going to stay late. I'm going to try to get this done no matter how long it takes. And in light of this, I realized, oh, that is a learned helplessness sort of response. I conditioned myself to like not see the open door of just going and talking to my manager and saying like, you know, can we negotiate this? And I think there's like many places in my life that's probably the case. Like, you know, you think about like asking for help from your parents, or I don't know. Another thing that was pretty neat about setting up the stress alert system is I started to learn how my body felt when that light was red. And I can, you know, it's physiologically, I could feel like my chest getting tighter. And so even when I wasn't actively monitoring myself, I could pick out like, oh, I'm feeling stressed out right now. Like when I was sitting there for this past hour before coming up here and talk. It's like, okay, this is a stress response. And what's funny is that I wasn't actually that aware of that feeling beforehand. And so in being able to identify it, I kind of developed a new stress sense that I didn't have before. One thing you'll notice about this talk is I'm not showing you a lot of data. It's more of a story. I'm not sharing a lot. In that, you know, I have a lot of heart rate variability data, but it won't really mean that much. I mean, I've never really done any sort of analysis, and I'm not really looking for anything in the data. What was important for me was just like how having the feedback cycle was really important. Having something to say you are stressed at the exact moment when my body was feeling stressed, allowed me to see things, allowed me to make connections that I was never able to make beforehand. And what that taught me is the brain is a powerful pattern matching machine. It just needs information presented to it in a certain way to allow you to pick up on those patterns. And so rapid feedback is the key. And if you want to learn about yourself, finding ways to get rapid feedback is really important. And the reason why rapid feedback is important is that if it's delayed, if the feedback is delayed, it makes it so much more difficult to pick out those patterns. So, for instance, many people have no idea that they have food insensitivities. And the reason why is they eat something, it tastes good, but then they get the feedback hours later, and they're not very good at saying like, oh, I'm feeling bad now. I wonder if it's related to that thing that tasted good, 2 hours ago. So that's like a good example how it's like you could you could have dairy your entire life. It could not be good for you, and you will never notice. You will never put those two together. I've given this talk a couple times, and one question that comes up is all stress bad? Am I trying to avoid all stress? Is that a good thing? And one thing that I've learned through this process and this sort of dialogue I've had with myself and trying to understand stress better, and through doing some reading and studies, is that there's a big difference between stress you can control and stress that you can't control. And what I mean by that is, if a stressful event comes, if you can be proactive and if you can do something about it, you have a physiologically different response. Whereas if something just happens to you and you have no control and you can't do anything about it, it is much, much worse. So for instance, one thing I noticed while I was doing this sort of like measurements at my stress alert system is, I remember I had this assignment and I had to get it done at the end of the day. And it normally would have been really stressful. But I noticed I was doing it, and I was expecting my stress alert system to go off. I'm like, it's, the stressful situation is going to go off. And it didn't go off. It was green the entire time. And my first thought was like, okay, is this thing not working? But then I realized, even though it was a stressful situation, I knew what to do. It was like, I know how I'm going to analyze this data, like I know like which functions I'm going to use, like I felt in control. And because I felt in control, my body physiologically acted differently, responded differently. And so I read some research later that seems to back this up. They looked at people in a workplace and how stress affects them, and found that people who are higher up in the corporate ladder tend not to get as stressed as people who are lower. Even though the people on the upper rungs, the upper levels, have more stressful jobs, they have more ability to actually do something about it when something comes up. Some big stressful thing comes up, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to assign you to do that, and I have the authority to do this. Whereas if you are low on the corporate ladder, things will just happen to you, and it's like, oh, you have to get this done by the end of the day. Well, I can't get it done by the end of the day. Well, you're going to have to figure out some way to do it, and you have no ability to be proactive. And so along those lines, there are people, I think, it's not Jane McGonigal, it's her twin sister. I can't remember her last name. But she talks about how if you can teach yourself to reinterpret stress, and you see stress not as a threat, but as an opportunity to show your talents, then you'll stay in the green. You won't go to the red. But yeah, so in conclusion, just simply measuring something can cause you to go down this path of finding a lot about yourself, but also to become a lot smarter about science. And so I noticed that, like, my understanding of stress, like, grew, I don't know, tenfold from where I was when I started. And there's a couple other people in Quantified Self who are very interested in heart rate variability and could give a much more technical talk than I can about it. And they were just people like me who just thought it was interesting, dug into it. And now they're probably in the top 5% of people who know about stress, like in the world. It's actually pretty incredible. So another value of Quantified Self is it actually teaches you a lot about science, because you just learn a lot more about things that you personally engage with. So that's my name, that's my Twitter handle. Thank you so much for having me, especially to you, Andreas. I really appreciate it. Yeah, there we go.